The last of the jerky was gone. Silas Blackwood held the final, rock-hard piece in his palm, its edges sharp against his calloused skin. It was barely a mouthful, and it was all that stood between him and a winter of thin soup made from dried beans and whatever tough game he could shoot with a hand that ached with a deep, familiar cold. The bullet that had passed through it years ago had left a ghost behind, a phantom that woke in the Montana frost and made the simple act of chopping wood an exercise in gritted teeth misery. His cabin, nestled in a hollow with a clear view of the jagged peaks, was sturdy. The claim, filed legally and properly, was his, but a man couldn't eat log walls, and he couldn't drink a paper deed. He was a gunslinger who had tried to bury the gun, a man known more for his past than his present. The folks in Redemption Gulch kept their distance, their greetings polite, but their eyes wary. They saw the way he carried himself, the quiet stillness that was not peace, but a coiled readiness. They didn't offer help, and his pride, a stubborn and useless thing, wouldn't let him ask for it. Therefore he found himself tacking a small, hand-scrawled notice to the rough-hewn community board outside the general store. The wind bit at his exposed ears, and the few townspeople out in the street gave him wide berth. The notice was simple, stripped of all but necessity. Help wanted for winter, cooking and chores, room and board provided. He expected, if anyone answered at all, it would be some down-on-his-luck prospector with whiskey on his breath, or a drifter with empty pockets and a shifty gaze. He could handle a man like that. He knew the language of desperate men. But 3 days later, it was not a man who stood on his porch. The dust of the road had barely settled from a passing freight wagon when he saw her. She was young, no more than 19, and Chinese. She stood there alone, holding a small, tightly wrapped bundle, her posture straight despite the biting wind that whipped at the hem of her dress. The dress itself was a shock, a clean but startlingly white prairie dress, the kind a farmer's daughter might wear to church. It was utterly impractical for the encroaching winter, a statement of either foolishness or a profound lack of anything else to wear. Silas stayed behind his door, watching her through the small window pane. He saw the townsfolk noticing her, their heads turning, their conversations pausing. A Chinese woman, alone, walking deliberately to the homestead of Silas Blackwood. It was a spectacle. He finally opened the door, the cold air rushing in. She did not flinch. Her dark eyes met his, direct and serious. "You are the one who seeks help?" she asked. Her English was quiet, the words chosen with a careful precision. "I am," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. "I can cook," she stated. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple declaration of fact. He looked from her small frame to the vast, unforgiving landscape behind her. He saw the worn-out soles of her shoes, the way she clutched her bundle as if it were the only anchor she had in the world. Every instinct he had, honed over a decade of watching men's hands and reading their intentions, screamed that this was a complication he did not need. The town already saw him as an outsider. Taking in a foreign girl would only deepen the trench between them. It was foolish. It was dangerous. But when he looked at his own hands, the knuckles swollen with cold, and thought of the empty pantry and the long, silent months ahead, he knew he was the desperate one. "The work is hard," he said, testing her. "The winters here are not kind." "I am not afraid of work," she replied, her gaze unwavering. He let out a long breath, the vapor pluming in the frigid air. "What's your name?" "Jing." He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in before you freeze. We'll talk inside." As she stepped over his threshold, he knew he had just invited in a mystery far deeper and more complicated than a simple winter cook. The first week was a study in silence.
Jing moved through his small, masculine cabin with a quiet efficiency that was both a relief and a constant, low-grade disturbance. She found his meager supplies without asking, her small hands transforming dried beans, a little flour, and a smoked ham hock into a soup so rich and savory it seemed to warm the very logs of the walls. The cabin, which had for years smelled only of wood smoke, old leather, and gun oil, began to smell of baking bread, of ginger, of things Silas couldn't name, but which spoke of life and care. He watched her, unsure what to do with himself in his own home.
She never spoke unless spoken to, and her face was a polite, placid mask. She mended a tear in his canvas coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She kept the fire fed and the floor swept. She did everything she was hired to do, and more. Yet she remained a complete stranger. He felt like a guest in his own life. He would find himself watching her hands as she kneaded dough, small but strong, or the way she'd pause and look out the window at the snow-dusted peaks, her expression unreadable. He learned her rhythms. She rose before the sun, the soft sounds of her movements a new kind of alarm clock. She ate her meals quickly and quietly after he was finished. In the evenings she would sit by the fire, but not with idle hands. She had a small block of wood and a sharp knife, and she would carve, letting thin, fragrant curls of pine fall to the hearth. Silas would clean his rifle on the other side of the fire, the metallic scrape and click a familiar counterpoint to the soft whisper of her blade. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was vast and deep. Then the blizzard came. It descended from the mountains without warning, a howling white fury that erased the world. For 6 days they were sealed inside the cabin as snow piled up against the door and windows, the wind screaming like a banshee. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, and the two of them. The enforced proximity should have been suffocating, but instead it began to chip away at the silence. It started with small things. He taught her how to play solitaire, her brow furrowing in concentration as she learned the suits.
She, in turn, showed him the characters she was carving into the wood, explaining that one meant strength and another home. He found himself talking, telling her stories of the land, of the way a cougar walks, of how to read the clouds. He didn't talk about his past, and she didn't talk about hers, but they began to fill the space between them with the present. When the storm finally broke, Redemption Gulch was a town buried and starving. The supply wagons were weeks overdue, and what little was left in the general store was being rationed by its owner, Marcus Thorne, at prices that amounted to extortion. Thorne was a man who dressed like a gentleman from back east, but whose eyes held the cold calculus of a predator. He held the town's debt, and he was using the blizzard to tighten his grip. He had made no secret of his desire for Silas's land. It had the strongest running creek in the valley. One afternoon, Silas saw them coming. Thorne was in the lead, flanked by a half-dozen townsmen, their faces pinched with hunger and anxiety. They trudged through the deep snow, their purpose clear. Silas instinctively reached for the Winchester leaning against the wall. Jing put a hand on his arm. It was a light touch, but it stopped him cold. "Wait," she said, her voice low. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hand. The cold was sharp, the sun on the snow blinding.
"Blackwood," Thorne called out, his voice smooth and pleasant, a jarring sound in the desperate quiet. "A word." "State your business, Thorne." Thorne smiled, a tight, unpleasant motion of his lips. "Word is you've been weathering the storm quite well. Comfortable, well fed. Some of the folks here," he gestured to the men behind him, "are not so fortunate. We were thinking you might be inclined to share your good fortune. A community contribution, you might say." It was a shakedown, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of civic duty. The men behind him looked uneasy, but hunger was a powerful motivator. Silas felt the old anger, the familiar coldness rise in him. It would be so easy to raise the rifle, to end this conversation the way he used to end them. But before he could speak, the cabin door opened again. Jing stepped out, carrying the large cast-iron pot from the stove. Steam billowed from it, carrying a scent so rich and warm it was almost a physical blow.
She walked to the edge of the porch, her face calm, and looked, not at Thorn, but at the hungry men behind him. "There is hot stew," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "Beef and barley. There is enough for everyone." She set the pot down on a crate and produced a ladle and a stack of tin bowls from inside the door. She looked at the men, her expression open and inviting. "Please," she said, "eat." The men looked at each other, then at Thorn, then back at the steaming pot. One of them, a blacksmith named Peterson, whose children were sick, shuffled forward, holding out his hands. Jing filled a bowl and gave it to him. He mumbled a thank you and retreated, cradling the bowl like it was treasure. Another man followed, then another. They had come as a mob, but she had disarmed them with a simple act of kindness. They were no longer a threat. They were just hungry men being fed. Thorn's face was a mask of cold fury. His plan to isolate and villainize Silas had been undone by a pot of soup. He watched as his posse dissolved, the men slurping greedily from their bowls, their eyes avoiding his. He turned his gaze on Silas, the pretense of civility gone. "A clever little trick," he hissed, his voice low enough that only Silas could hear. "Your pet is well trained." He looked from Jing back to Silas. "But winter is long, and kindness runs out. That deed in your pocket is still just a piece of paper, and paper burns." He turned and stalked back toward the town, his expensive boots leaving deep, angry prints in the snow. Silas watched him go, the rifle in his hand suddenly feeling very heavy. The immediate threat was gone, but a larger, colder one had just taken its form. That night, the fire seemed to cast deeper shadows. The confrontation had changed something in the cabin. The silence that returned was different, heavier with things unsaid. Silas found he couldn't settle.
He cleaned the Winchester, a task that usually calmed him, but his hands felt clumsy. He kept seeing the look on Thorn's face, the undisguised venom. This wasn't about a grudge anymore. It was about the land, and Thorn was not a man who gave up. He finally looked across the hearth at Jing. She was carving again, her focus absolute, but he sensed she was as unsettled as he was. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice quiet. She paused, her knife still. "They were hungry." "That wasn't about hunger," he countered. "Not for Thorn. You put yourself in the middle of something that isn't your concern." She set down her carving and looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "I live here. You gave me shelter. That makes it my concern." She paused. "He wants to drive you out, to take this place." "He's been wanting that since I filed the claim," Silas admitted. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "A man like Thorn, he doesn't fight with fists or guns. He uses paper, lawyers, the kind of fight I don't know how to win." For the first time, he let her see the weariness that lived deep inside him. "Why here, Silas?" she asked softly, using his given name for the first time. "Of all the places you could go, why did you choose this one?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I was tired," he said. "Tired of moving, tired of looking over my shoulder. I saw this valley, and it was quiet. I thought I could be quiet here, too. Leave the rest of it behind." "The rest of it?" she prompted gently. He shook his head. "It's not a story for a winter's night." He looked at her. "What about you, Jing? Redemption Gulch isn't exactly on the way to anywhere. How did you end up answering a notice on a board in a town like this?" She looked down at her hands, at the half-finished carving of a bird. "My father and I came from California. He was promised good work on the railroad, blasting the tunnels through these mountains." Her voice was low, stripped of emotion. "He was a good man, strong. He believed in the promise. but the mountain does not care about promises. She took a slow breath. There was a collapse, a miscalculation with the blasting powder. Many men were lost. My father was one of them. The railroad company had called it a tragedy. They had given her $20 and told her to be grateful.
She was alone, in a work camp full of rough men with no papers and no family. My father, he taught me to cook, but he also taught me to read, to write, English too. He said knowledge was the one thing they could not take from you. I made my way from camp to camp, cooking, cleaning, saving what I could. I heard there was work in the mining towns. I bought a ticket on a freight wagon. It dropped me here. I had $4 left. Then I saw your notice. She reached into a small cloth bag she always kept near and pulled out a small object. It was the finished bird carving, worn smooth with handling. He made this for me, she said, her voice catching for the first time. The night before the collapse. It is all I have left of him. Silas felt something loosen in his chest, a hard knot of his own making. He had seen her as a mystery, a complication, but she was just a survivor, same as him, only her battles had been fought with quiet endurance instead of loud violence. He had thought he was sheltering her, but he was beginning to understand that she had a strength he couldn't comprehend. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. A U.S. Marshal, his coat dusted with snow from a long ride, appeared at their door, and with him, smiling his predatory smile, was Marcus Thorne. "Blackwood," the marshal said, his tone official and weary. "I'm Marshal Evans. I have a court order here from the territorial office in Helena." Thorne stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. "It seems there's been a mistake with your claim, Blackwood, a clerical error. As you can see, I hold a prior deed to this parcel, properly filed and registered a full 6 months before yours." He handed the papers to the marshal, who passed them to Silas. Silas looked at the document. It looked official, covered in seals and signatures. The date was clear. If it was legitimate, his own homestead claim was worthless. "This is a fraud," Silas said, his voice a low growl.
"The law will decide that," Thorne said smoothly. "Marshal Evans is here to serve you notice. You have 30 days to present evidence to the territorial court proving the precedence of your claim. If you fail to do so, you are to vacate this property. The court has recognized my ownership." 30 days. In the dead of winter. A trip to Helena was a week's ride each way, assuming the passes weren't snowed in. It was an impossible deadline, designed to be. He was trapped. Thorne had him, not with a gun, but with a piece of paper. After the marshal and Thorne left, a heavy despair settled in the cabin. Silas paced the floor like a caged wolf. He saw his one chance at a quiet life slipping through his fingers. The old impulse rose in him. Run. Disappear. Leave it all behind and start over somewhere new. It was what he was good at.
"I'll give you what wages I can," he said to Jing, not looking at her. "You should pack your things. Go back to town. Thorne's fight is with me, not you." He expected her to agree. It was the sensible thing to do. Instead, he heard her stand up. "No," she said. He turned. Her face was set, her eyes burning with an intensity he had never seen before. "You will not run," she said. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a command. "This is your home. We will fight." "Fight with what?" he shot back, gesturing wildly. "I can't outlawyer him, and I can't outrun the calendar. It's over." "Let me see the papers," she said. "All of them. Your deed and the notice the marshal left." He threw them on the table in frustration. "What for? To read the eulogy?" She ignored his anger. She spread the documents out under the lantern light, her small finger tracing the lines of script. She was silent for a long time, her brow furrowed. She held Thorne's deed up to the light, then Silas's. She laid them side by side. "My father," she said softly, almost to herself. "He dealt with many papers from the railroad company. Pay vouchers, supply orders, contracts. He taught me to look at the paper itself, not just the words on it." Her finger stopped on a faint, almost invisible mark in the corner of Thorne's deed. A watermark. "The paper mill in Bozeman," she whispered. "The one with the watermark of the 3 peaks." The foreman at the camp complained about it, said their paper was expensive but strong. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide. That mill did not open until last spring. I remember, because the foreman said we would finally get proper ledgers. Silas stared at her, the meaning of her words slowly dawning on him. He looked at the date on Thorne's deed. It was from the autumn of the year before. The deed was dated 6 months before the paper it was printed on even existed. It was the proof he needed, the undeniable evidence of forgery. Jing, with her quiet memory and a lesson from her father, had found the key. She had given him a way to fight back. Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it did, it came with a fierce and sudden beauty. The snow receded, revealing the deep green of new grass, and the creek beside the cabin swelled with meltwater, its song a constant, cheerful burble. The air itself felt new. 3 months had passed since the day Marshall Evans had stood on their porch. Marcus Thorne was gone. Faced with Jing's irrefutable evidence, his scheme had unraveled. The marshal, a man who disliked being used as a pawn, had launched a full investigation. He discovered Thorne had been using forged deeds and fraudulent claims to scare settlers off their land all across the territory. His polite manners and expensive suits had hidden a rot that ran deep. The last anyone in Redemption Gulch heard, Thorne was in a territorial prison, awaiting a trial he was certain to lose.
The town itself seemed to breathe easier with him gone. The general store was now run by a co-op of townsfolk, with fair prices for everyone. The suspicion that had once followed Silas like a shadow had vanished. He was no longer the outsider, the quiet man with a dangerous past. He was Silas Blackwood, the homesteader who had stood up to Thorne and won. And standing with him, in the town's eyes, was Jing. She was no longer the strange, foreign girl. She was the one who had fed them when they were hungry, the one whose quiet wisdom had saved a good man's home. Women now stopped her to ask for cooking advice, and men tipped their hats respectfully. Her small kitchen garden, planted with seeds she'd carefully saved, was a patch of vibrant green order behind the cabin. One bright Sunday morning, the circuit preacher came through town. The clapboard church, which was often half empty, was filled to bursting.
The whole of Redemption Gulch was there to see Silas Blackwood, dressed in a clean shirt and his best coat, stand before the altar. Beside him stood Jing. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, practical and sturdy. The white prairie dress she had arrived in was folded away, a relic from another life. Silas hadn't had money for a proper ring. Instead, as the preacher spoke the old, familiar words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth gold nugget, the only thing of value he had kept from a brief, failed attempt at prospecting years before. It was a piece of the country itself, solid and real. He placed it in her waiting palm. Her hand was warm, and as her fingers closed around the nugget, he saw it. Tucked into the collar of her dress, safe and close to her heart, was the small, carved wooden bird. The last remnant of her old life was now present at the beginning of her new one. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked onto his porch as a stranger looking for shelter. He had hired a cook for the winter, someone to handle the chores his aching hand could not. He had been looking for simple help to survive. But what he found was a partner who had seen the good in him when no one else had, who had shown him that a home was not just a claim to be defended, but a life to be built. She had filled the profound silence in his cabin and in his soul, a silence so old he had forgotten it could ever be filled. A man could survive a winter alone, but he was learning it took another person to truly make a place a home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.